So today's topic, abortion and human rights. What I want to do in this session is I want to unpack and give a reasoned defence for the pro-life position. I want to respond to the pro-choice, the very common pro-choice arguments that you hear. And hopefully by the end of it, you will be equipped with some excellent, I don't just want to stop at rhetoric, but you will be able to actually respond well, intelligently and compassionately to engagements that you have on this issue with people who might have strongly held views in the other direction. Before I start and do that though, first thing I should say is three important points. I think it's always important to understand that, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here already, but from a pro-life perspective, that our approach always is one of compassion on this issue. The reality is that there are a lot of women who have been affected, a lot of men, a lot of couples who have been affected by this issue. And I think even though today I'm going to be focusing in on the ethical questions around abortion, this obviously is an issue that impacts a lot of people in a very detrimental way. And I certainly don't wish or intend to try and cast or pass judgment on people for situations they may have experienced previously, particularly those who have experienced the pain of abortion in their life. I say that as someone in a former life when I was making some decisions I'm not particularly proud of, I experienced the challenge of an unplanned pregnancy and the possibility of abortion in a relationship that I was in. And I understand what it's like to be in that situation, and I know that from the best available research that we have, that a large percentage of women who are choosing abortion are not really choosing at all. There's a lot of coercive factors that go into it. The other thing I want to say too is that my time here today is limited in this session, so I can't cover everything, and I've tried to sort of focus in on what I think are the key arguments and how to respond well to them. This is a topic you could spend a whole day unpacking. In fact, those who have attended one of the pro-life internships that we run, so Rebecca and others who are in the room have been here to the Australian ones. We've been running it in New Zealand for the last 7 years now as well, which is a 5-day intensive training course for 18 to 35-year-olds. That you will know that we spend most of one whole day actually focusing in and really unpacking some of these arguments. The other thing I'll say too, I'll apologise in advance. I come from New Zealand, so there's a bit of an accent. We speak the Queen's English, so I apologise if there's any. So that sounded a bit offensive, didn't it? So let me take that back. We speak broken English. So I apologise if there's any confusion about anything I'm saying here. Please feel free to grab me afterwards, and I'll give you the official dictionary. First thing I want to start by saying is this, and I think it's important to remind people of this, is that this is actually not a religious issue. That's right. And a lot of people are surprised when I say that. I've spoken in all sorts of environments and arenas. I remember once speaking in a very hostile university crowd in Wellington, our capital city. And it was interesting, a lot of them were taken aback by this because what they had expected was that there was going to be a whole lot of religious discussion about this issue. The reason why, this is why we have in the United States, for example, alone, and according to the latest census data, they have more than 6 million secular, non-religious pro-lifers now. So these are people who self-identify as atheist or agnostic, and who are also pro-life. This is why we have groups who are huge and growing, like secular pro-life, started by some atheists. We have the pro-life humanists. We have the pro-life alliance of gays and lesbians. We have the new wave feminists. So the fundamental point I think that we should take from this, and we should be reminding people of, is that this is actually a human rights issue. This is about treatment of human persons. Because as I see it, and hopefully you will, if you don't already, will agree with me by the end of this presentation, we have an entire class of persons currently in our society who are not being afforded their fundamental rights and respects that they should be given. And I would argue that's a problem. Which brings me to the most important question of all whenever this issue of abortion arises. It's funny, we talk a lot, whenever, certainly in my country, I don't think it's any exception around other parts of the world, whenever this issue arises, people talk all around this issue, and lots of tangents are entered into, but often, or most of the time in fact, I'd argue that the most important question of all is simply never asked, let alone properly explored. And that question is this: what is the entity which grows in the female womb during pregnancy? What is it? It's a pretty simple question. Now, please understand that, as I've already mentioned, obviously every situation of unplanned pregnancy, every pregnancy has its own unique potential complications and issues and challenges. But on the ethical question, it does boil down to this one simple question: what is the entity growing in the female womb during pregnancy? You see, if the answer to that question is that it's nothing more than a blob of tissue or a clump of cells, which, by the way, is not an argument for abortion, because you and I also happen to be a blob of tissue and a clump of cells. My wife might say I'm a little bit too much of a blob of tissue at the moment, but I am a blob of tissue. I'm obviously a large and, well, I've stopped growing, hopefully, and maybe shrinking one. But the point is that all you are doing there is telling me what that entity is made of. You're talking about its biological material. You're not telling me what it is or what rights it should be entitled to. But this question here is so fundamentally important, because if the answer to this question is that it's not human, it's not living, then effectively we're all wasting our time being here today. I've wasted the last 14 years of my life. We may as well, in fact, we're a little bit crazy. We may as well be out there protesting the destruction of the innocent human appendixes. We should form an anti-appendectomy group, because that's how logical our position is. If the answer to that question is that it's just nothing more than a clump of cells, it's not human. However, and this is the big and very important part, if the answer to that question is that it's an innocent living human being, then we've got a very serious problem on our hands as a culture with abortion. Because abortion would be the gravest violation of human rights that we've ever perpetrated. It's that simple. If the answer to that question is it's an innocent living human person. Now, I was involved in a film and television school debate about 12 years ago in New Zealand. And this is where they train all the media staff for our media. And they set up these mock debates regularly, and they have producers and directors, and they film and they bring in a studio audience, and it's all to train people in journalism and media skills and practical technical skills for work in the media. In this particular session, they decided they were going to tackle the issue of abortion in this mock debate. So I was one of two panel members on the pro-life side. And I remember starting with this point, and then the debate carried on. We finished up, and as they were packing up for the day, one of the senior lecturers there, the lady who's in her 50s and very experienced in New Zealand media circles, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, you know what, she said, I'm pro-choice, so I disagree with the stance you have on this issue. But she said, I think you're right. That is the most important question. And what she said next was very interesting. She said to me, you know what, Brendan, if I'm honest, I don't want to ask myself that question because I think I already know what the answer is. Now, I don't think she's alone in that. Because every year in my country, we keep pretty good abortion statistics. And whenever the abortion statistics come out, they just came out last Monday in my country, another decrease. We're at a 25-year low now, which is awesome. And whenever those statistics come out, we get two responses from pro-choice people and groups. If there's been an increase in the abortion numbers, they say we need to do something to reduce these numbers. We need to implement more sex ed or more morning after pill or whatever it is they think is going to fix the problem. If there's been a decrease, they come out and they say, look, the sex ed and the morning after pill is working, despite research to the contrary. But the interesting thing I always have in response to that is, what does it matter how many abortions take place in India or Australia for that matter? If there's nothing wrong with one abortion, what's the problem with 12,000, 18,000, 30,000 of them? I think probably realistically we can all in our minds, if we're not particularly well formed in this area, we can rationalise away one abortion. We can think of someone we know in a difficult situation. I think people regularly do this, and they sort of say, "Oh, that would be that would solve a problem," and they have a whole lot of rationalisations. But when you're confronted with the raw data of the total number of abortions that take place in your country each year, it's a bit harder to rationalise and justify that, I think. And so a lot of people instinctively know there is actually a problem here. I think we still have a conscience on this issue, even if we, like that lecturer, don't necessarily want to confront that. So, let's explore the big question then. What is that entity? Now people say, oh, it's a fetus, Brendan. Great, you're right. Fetus is a Latin word, it means little one, little child. But what is it? What actually is it? I'm glad you asked. Let's look. I think that we're dealing here with an innocent human person. Why do I think that? Well, first of all, to answer that question, we need to take a little step back and ask perhaps a much bigger question is, what is a human person? What is it that makes you a human person? What is it that makes you, that we can look at something and we can say, that is definitely a person, that's not a person, this is not a person, this is definitely a person. What are the unique characteristics and traits? And it really boils down to two things: rationality and free will. If you have a rational intellect, and you have free will, then we know you're not an animal, we know you're not a computer, we know you're a human person. If you can think about thinking, we don't just think, we think about thinking. That's why we ask the big why questions. Why am I here? What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of my existence? Chickens don't wander around the chicken yard, pecking away, asking those big questions. Why am I here? What is the meaning of my chicken existence? Where are my friends going in that big red and white truck with KFC on the side of it? They don't ask the big why questions, right? That's why we eat them in restaurants. Okay? And obviously, a part of rationality is there's a whole lot of things. We do art. We seek out the divine. We engage in, we seek out transcendent experience, spirituality, religion, etc. You won't go home tonight and find that your cat has built a little altar and is now worshipping your dog, okay? They don't do that kind of thing. We have free will, the ability to transcend, to rise above our urges and choose to do the good even when we might be tempted to do the exact opposite. Now these are the unique markers of what it is to be a person. You didn't need to come here today to know that though, or to learn that. We all operate on this truth. It's what we call a self-evident truth. It is so self-evident that you don't need to be told. Our society operates according to this truth without even thinking about it. Just let me give you an example. Let's say that you came home one day and found that your next door neighbour's dog had broken into your house, destroyed your house, ripped up your favourite couch, destroyed a whole lot of your personal property, and was sitting there chewing your favourite shoes, just destroying them, salivating all over them. What's the first thing you'd do? Would you call the police and demand that this dog was arrested for breaking and entering? Perhaps that should be charged, go to court, appear before a magistrate, possibly go to jail for, the criminal nuisance it's caused. And on the way out, you notice that, oh, look, it's got a little cross hanging around its neck. It must be a religious dog, so perhaps it should get a Christian minister to help sort out some of the issues in its life, right? We don't do that, do we? However, if you came home that same day and found your next door neighbour had broken into your house and had done all of those things and covered your walls in tinfoil and was standing there coated in tinfoil himself, screaming maniacally at you, and let's pretend that he's sane, he's not unwell, mentally unwell, he just doesn't like you, and he's decided to do this, you would call the police. You would expect that he could be charged, that possibly he could go to jail for his crime, and that perhaps if he needed intervention in his life from someone else, a counsellor or a therapist or someone, that he would get that, right? The reason we don't put animals in jail or put them on trial is because they don't have an intellect and a will. It's self-evident. We live in the reality of that truth. So rationality and free will are what make you a person. At which point some people respond and say, well, but hold on a minute, Brendan. The fetus isn't doing anything rational, and it's not choosing to do anything. Some philosophers will try and argue. But here's another important point. You don't have to be doing these things right now to be a human person. Why? Well, when you go to sleep at night, you cease to do either of these two things. Your brain goes onto autopilot. You do not do anything rational. You do not act according to free will. You slip into a state of unconsciousness and you wake up 8 hours later and you don't even know how much time has passed. If you're knocked out on a sports field, like the great Richie McCaw. Oh, wrong name? Okay. The great John Eels. You're knocked out on a sports field somewhere, or you are in a medically induced coma, or you're under anaesthetic waiting for an operation. You're not doing either of these two things, but it's not okay to end your life, is it? You're still a person. Why? Because you have these two capacities within you waiting and potential to be exercised, to be realised. And so does a fetus, an unborn human being. It might not be doing these two things right now, but it has these potentials within itself. These two potentials are exclusive to human persons. Only human persons can have them. And if a fetus has them, how can it be anything other than a human person? It really is that simple. Now, some people at this point will often say to me, Brendan, but, I've watched Monty Python, so are you suggesting that, every sperm and every egg is a human person, because don't they have these potentials as well? Well, no, they don't. Before the point of conception, you obviously have the two gametes, the sperm and the ovum, and then at the point of conception, they fuse together. That's a rather friendly graphic, isn't it? It's a child-friendly graphic. They fuse together and they form something new, a new substance that we call a new human life. And that new human life, that tiny developing embryo, is the one that has the potential within it of intellect and free will, rationality and free will. Neither of these two do. They have to both merge and cease to exist. And then the entity which comes into existence at this point is what has rationality and free will within itself. And if we allow it to continue on its self-directed, which is an important growth trajectory, and don't interfere with it, guess what? We find that a few years later, it's rationalising, arguing with its parents, trying to get its own way. Right? Now, some people say, well, Brendan, how do we hold this? This is philosophy. Who really knows? We live in the age of scientism and empiricism. Who really knows? Well, okay, let's be skeptics. I can be a skeptic with you. Let's all be skeptics together. Because if we don't know what it is, we definitely shouldn't be causing any harm to it until we've ascertained that it's not human. Because there's a really strong case here. We're dealing with an innocent human being. The first and most important principle of human ethics is do no harm. Often, referred to as the principle of non-malfeasance, and closely related to it is the principle of beneficence, acting for the benefit of the subject. The second most important principle in human ethics is what we might call the precautionary principle. And it goes like this. If you're not sure whether your actions are about to cause harm to an innocent human being or group of human beings, you shouldn't act until you're certain that you're not going to be causing harm. The classic scenario where we see this played out is with the issue of hunting. It happens a lot in my country. We're a big hunting country. And regularly, or recently anyway, particularly, we had a spate of accidental shootings in the bush. And a lot of them involve hunters who hear a rustling off in the distance and they unload their weapon and then they pull back the foliage and discover they've killed an innocent person. Now, if a hunter does that and then appears before the judge can't say to the judge, well, look, Your Honour, animals rustle as well. I don't know as a human, I just fired. I really shouldn't be charged with anything. The judge would rightly say, no, you have an ethical obligation to identify your target first. That's the precautionary principle. And the same is true in the abortion debate. If we haven't identified the target of abortion, and we're saying, well, we don't know what it is, then we shouldn't be acting until we've ascertained we're not actually causing harm. Now, at this point, you get pro-choice people who will try and respond with 4 different main categories of argument. And I want to unpack those now. And these are the 4 main categories. And by the way, I didn't come up with this acronym, so please don't credit me with it. A guy called Scott Klusendorf in the States, I believe, was the first to use it, but it's been used by many people. The acronym is SLED: size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. And these are the 4 main categories of argument that people will use to try and give some sort of ethical justification to abortion. I want to unpack each one of these now, and I'm going to unpack them slightly out of this particular order. I want to end with environment because I want to talk about the equality rights argument that you commonly hear people using. So first of all, arguments from science. Now, thankfully we don't hear a lot of these anymore, but it used to be common to hear people talking about the size of the unborn as if that somehow meant that they should have less rights than the rest of us. Thankfully, because of advances in science and medical technology, it's a bit of a silly argument to be making now. You still get some people, though, who will sort of try and make a version of this argument where they will talk about, are you saying that a clump of cells should have the same rights as a fully grown person? Okay, that's an argument around size. What's important about this is that to note and to respond whenever people bring these kind of arguments up is that your size doesn't determine what you are, or what rights you are or are not entitled to. A small 1 foot high child, 2 foot high child, is no less human, has no less human rights than a 7 foot NBA basketball player, right? Your size does not determine what rights you get, and it doesn't determine what you actually are. The next argument you hear is the degree of dependency, which is what? The viability argument. Is it viable? This is a very common argument people make. Now, this is an interesting and I would say very problematic position to adopt because viability is a real moving goalpost. Go back 150 years ago, a lot of people weren't viable even at childbirth. A lot of people died at childbirth. Our ability to save babies in utero a lot younger is slowly moving down further and further into pregnancy than it's ever been before because of advances in medical technology and therapies, etc., that we have available to us. And there's also that interesting issue of the fact that if you go from place to place, you might find that in one country viability might be 22, 23 weeks. They've got good technology, good access to good healthcare resources, etc. But you get on a plane and travel to another country and it might be closer to 35 weeks because they don't have that same resourcing and technology, which would present you with the interesting spectre of a pregnant woman, say at, I don't know, 34 weeks, who might be in New Zealand with a child as viable, and people are saying, well, yes, that makes the child a person. She gets on a plane and flies to, I don't know, the Nairobi desert or somewhere where they don't have those kind of resources available, and they're saying, well, no, not a person, because it's not viable in that place at that point. She gets back on a plane, flies back home again, all of a sudden the child has become a person again. Ultimately, though, the big problem with this argument is that what it's proposing is that unless you can live independently of an outside agent, you don't rely on an outside agent for your continued survival, then you're not a person, or you shouldn't get rights. Now, I'm sure I don't need to explain to you why that's extremely problematic, because they're actually adults, older children and adults, who are not independently viable. They depend on others outside of them for their existence. Obviously, the most obvious example of this is if you accept this principle, you also have to accept that infanticide was an ethically acceptable act. That's right. Because an infant cannot clothe, feed, shelter, hydrate, or care for itself. Right? Ultimately, too, if you think about it, all of us, every single one of us on this planet, cannot live without the aid of an outside agent. We actually rely on a very womb-like environment for our continued existence, and we absolutely depend on it. It's the atmosphere of this planet. It's almost amniotic, or some might say. Nurtures us, protects us. If the atmosphere of this planet was to disappear, we'd be dead in an instant. Right? So we all depend on that outside agent, and we intimately depend on it. We can't live without it. It's just that simple. The next type of arguments you hear are arguments around a level of development. Now, the most common type of argument you hear people making here, I've already referred to as this idea of self-awareness or rational thought. They use that as a developmental milestone, and they say, well, you're not a person until you're able to think rationally or you're self-aware. Here's the big problem with that, using that as a developmental milestone. First of all, it doesn't actually happen until many months after birth. You're not self-aware in the womb, you're not self-aware even after birth. It happens many months later. I remember when it happened with our twins. Our twins used to come in every morning and they would see themselves in the mirror, and Maddie would see her reflection in the mirror and she would go, Evie, because she thought it was her twin she was looking at, and vice versa. I remember when they were about 15 months old, one day Maddie comes into the room, sees her reflection, looks at the reflection and goes, Maddie. She realised, she'd become self-aware at some point and realised she's seeing self. Quite a profound thing. So obviously it's problematic if we're going to use self-awareness. And also, self-awareness isn't the highest level of brain development in that regard. There's another level called sapient thought, the ability to form abstract, objective thought. Right, that happens much later again. So if we're going to say it's a graduated process, then aren't we possibly suggesting that people are not really fully persons until they've gone beyond just self-awareness and reached that level of sapience? Now, obviously I've mentioned the problem of sleeping or being knocked unconscious and how you don't have rational thought. You're not self-aware in that state, but we still don't allow people to kill you because we say you are a person. Now, some philosophers get quite clever, usually the utilitarian philosophers like Peter Singer, David Boonen, David Tooley, a lot of Australians, I don't know why that is, a lot of utilitarian philosophers from Australia who support infanticide based on something they call the desire-interest argument. And what they say is this, yeah, you're right, being knocked unconscious as a child or an adult that's been born is not the same thing. You don't lose your personhood in that situation, but they say you're a different type of thing. And what they say is this, they say that what gives you your right to life is your interest in the right to life. And the way you get an interest in the right to life is you have to have developed desires. And you have to have developed the desire for life. And of course, an unborn child growing in the womb doesn't have desires, they would say, so therefore it has no right to life because it hasn't developed the desire for life. So it doesn't have a corresponding interest in the right to life. What they're effectively saying here is that you have to be aware that you are entitled to something, the right to life, or have a conscious desire for that right to life in order to be wronged by being denied that thing. But that's not true at all. That is simply not true at all. Let's say you have someone, Francis Beckwith, the philosopher, uses this example. Imagine you have someone who has raised their entire life in a cult, and they have been brainwashed to believe that human rights don't exist, they're not real. And they grow up believing that human rights are a tool of the government to try and control the population, And they genuinely believe that the only real right that there is might makes right. Survival of the fittest, the strong get to decide what happens to the weak. And let's say that this 18-year-old child decides to leave home and start out on their way and start their own cult. I don't know whatever you do when you've been in that situation. And on their merry way they go, and they are kidnapped 6 months later, and they're sold into slavery. Remember, they don't believe in human rights. They don't have a desire for the right to freedom. They don't believe it's a real thing. Are they being wronged? Are they the victims? Of course they are. You don't have to have a desire for something or even understand it. Obviously, this raises some very serious issues for certain people with certain intellectual disabilities who have no concept of what human rights are. But we wouldn't say, well, it would be okay to do horrible things to them just because they don't understand it. They're meant to desire these things, right? It's a terrible, terrible argument. Another example might be perhaps, let's say you have an uncle who you didn't realise this, but had won the lotto and had $40 million squirreled away and no one knew about it. And your uncle gave you in the will that $40 million. But he also had a bit of an unscrupulous and corrupt employee who at the last minute changed the will and forged a new one and gave it all to himself. Now, you weren't at a reading of the will because you weren't invited, your name wasn't on the list. But that $40 million is given to the unjust, corrupt employee. You never knew the money existed, you had no desire for it. Have you been the victim of something? Of course you have. Even though you had no desire for it or even no knowledge of it. You have still been wronged by being denied that thing. And the last type of argument, this is the one I want to spend a bit of time on, is environment, from the environment. What's the environment of an unborn child? The womb. Very good, right? Now, thankfully, you don't get too many people making sort of simplistic arguments. Some people do. Well, you know, they say we shouldn't treat you as a human being while you're in a womb. It's kind of a bizarre argument because it's suggesting that where you are determines what you are. One of my favourite responses to that is that if I go and spend the rest of my life living at McDonald's, I haven't become a Big Mac. So it's not how we determine what a person is, you know, by where they currently happen to be living. Most people, though, use this argument around environment to try and give rise to what's known as the bodily rights argument. And they would say that because an unborn person is growing inside someone else's womb, that we should treat them differently because now you've got two competing sets of rights in close proximity to each other. The lady that we have to thank primarily for this argument is this lady here, Judith Jarvis Thompson. In 1971, she published her very famous, some might say infamous essay, A Defence of Abortion. She's a philosopher. And this is still today the most widely republished and sought after journal article, still today. This thing appears in all sorts of university settings, even though they've got nothing to do with ethics. Judith Jarvis Thompson's, particularly her violinist analogy, turns up all over the place. And basically in her violinist analogy, she says this. Imagine you wake up one morning and you find yourself back to back with an unconscious, world-famous violinist. You have been strapped to this violinist, and this violinist has a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has kidnapped you and attached you to the violinist, and hooks up some tubes, your kidneys are feeding his kidneys, and you're purifying his blood. And she says, don't worry, it's only for 9 months. And after 9 months, he'll be fine, and you can go free. And then she goes on to say, well, basically, just like that situation where no one has the right to force another person to be attached to a world-famous violinist for 9 months, nor should a mother be forced to donate her organs to an unborn child for 9 months without her consent. So this idea of two competing sets of rights, who gets to win? What are the problems with this bodily rights argument? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's look at them quickly. Number one, it always ignores the fact that there's actually two bodies involved, not one. So why is only one of the bodies getting bodily rights, especially if you consider the fact that the majority of abortions that take place are on unborn females? Right? So if we talk about female bodily rights, what about the bodily rights of unborn females? A friend of mine who's a doctor, he used to say back in New Zealand, I totally support termination of pregnancy, natural termination at birth. That was his big thing. And he said, until then, unless you get consent from the unborn, I'm not going to participate in it. Right? And it's a good point though, right? What about the two bodies here? It's not just one body. The second thing is obviously the question around consent. The vast majority of pregnancies happen after consensual sexual intercourse. And if you engage in the most effective act for making a new human being, a new vulnerable, dependent human being, and you make a new vulnerable dependent human being, congratulations, it's worked, by the way. It's not an accident. Well, I touched the phone after the pregnant lady and I got pregnant. That's not how it works. So you'll understand how this works. But if you engage in the most effective act for making new vulnerable dependent human beings, and you make a new vulnerable dependent human being, isn't there an ethical question about not actually owning that responsibility? Because that new vulnerable dependent human being didn't force itself upon us. It didn't say, here I am, you will care for me. It's not like the violinist at all. You haven't been kidnapped yet. Especially when you consider that the sexual act itself, the whole purpose of the sexual act, if you go strip out any philosophical arguments and go pure biology, the sexual act from before the actual sexual act has even begun to take place, both bodies are trying to achieve pregnancy as the outcome, right? It is the intended outcome of this act. It confuses unintended death and deliberate killing. Right? If you unhook yourself from the violinist and run away, the violinist will die. But did you kill the violinist? No, you didn't. The fatal kidney ailment is what killed the violinist. But that's not what happens in an abortion. It's not simply an unplugging, a detaching. An abortionist goes in there and deliberately ends. So it's a direct and deliberate taking of an innocent human life. That's very different from someone unplugging themselves, and as an unintended secondary effect, a death occurs that they didn't cause and they had no intention of causing either. Pregnancy is not an act of violation. Effectively, the bodily rights argument sets up pregnancy as, from the starting point of pregnancy, as an act of violation that a woman will either consent to and that makes it okay, or if she doesn't consent, she's refusing a form of violation, right? That's how the argument is structured. That a pregnancy is something that's forced on a woman and she should never be forced to carry through with it. So what they're setting up is this idea that pregnancy from the get-go is not a good, but it's an act of violation. Well, it's not an act of violation. How do we know that? Well, let's imagine this scenario. Let's imagine a pregnant woman turns up in an A&E clinic after having a car accident and she's unconscious. And no one knows she's pregnant. She doesn't even know she's pregnant. And while they're doing blood tests and other tests to try and determine what her injuries are and what's wrong with her and how they can treat her, they discover she's pregnant. Not only do they discover she's pregnant, but her partner turns up, her friends turn up, her parents turn up. They even produce her diary where she has written that morning, we are not going to be having children for another 2 years, we're going overseas. Doesn't know she's pregnant, no desire for pregnancy. If the bodily rights argument is true, that woman is currently being subjected to a violation that she didn't consent to. So in theory, shouldn't the doctor go in there immediately and perform an abortion on that unconscious woman? Now everyone rightly recoils in horror and says, well, no, of course not. You're right. Because pregnancy is not an act of violation. That's why you don't treat it as one. However, if the Music Lovers Society turned up and started hooking up a violinist to that unconscious accident victim, we would stop that. Because it's not the same thing. That is an act of violation. And because it's not an act of violation, you can't claim, as some people try and do, that abortion is a form of self-defence. For there to be a self-defence, there also has to be an unjust aggressor. The unborn child is not an unjust aggressor. In fact, I'd argue they're probably the most innocent amongst us. Sure. Now, an unjust aggressor has to have intent to do harm. But remember, the unborn child did not even ask to be brought into existence in this way. They are brought into existence by two other people. So you can't claim that this is an act of self-defence. Two more to go. The bodily rights argument ignores this important and profound truth about parental obligations. As a parent, I have obligations that are unique to my own children that I don't have to any other children. Now, hopefully I'll care for what happens to my neighbour's kids, but I don't have to educate, clothe and feed and shelter them, right? If I see something going wrong, hopefully I'll help out and be part of the solution, but I'm not held legally accountable for my neighbour's kids, but I am for my own. And if I don't feed, clothe, shelter and protect my own children and I cause them harm, then the courts will rightly come after me. I could even go to jail for that if it's serious enough. The bodily rights argument completely ignores the parental obligations that we have to our own offspring. And interestingly enough, which brings me to my last and final point, the bodily rights argument also seems to completely fly in the face of the whole concept of child support. Men who pay child support for children, regardless of whether they want them or not. The court says, oh, I'm sorry, you can't just say, Mr. Joe Bloggs, that you consented to sex, but you didn't want to use your bodily labours to pay for a baby. You never ask for a baby. You actually have to provide financial support from your own bodily labours. Because why? Parental obligations, that's your child. A friend of mine who's a New Zealand ethics and PhD in abortion ethics wrote a very clever paper once where he said, okay, let's use the bodily rights argument to justify men not having to pay child support. It's a position he didn't accept. He absolutely believes men should pay child support. But it was interesting to see the response, particularly from some more militant feminist quarters who responded to that. And they were unflinching in their very staunch response to it. And he rightly pointed out, well, hold on a minute, let's walk back through this and look at how the same argument is being used to try and justify abortion. Why is it valid there and not there? See, what the bodily rights argument does is it actually asks the wrong question as a starting point. The question the bodily rights argument asks is this: does the fetus have the right to occupy the womb? And in one sense, there is actually no universal human right to occupy a womb. I can't ring my mother up and say, Mum, I had a really tough day in Brisbane, coming back to the womb tomorrow. She's probably saying, thank goodness, right? Now, but there is no universal. Now, other ethicists and I agree with this, would argue that because one of your other important human rights after the right to life is the right to never be deliberately deprived the essentials of life. And for a very young developing human being, the womb isn't just an environment, it is an essential for life. They rely on it for their continued existence very early on in the pregnancy. And if it's always wrong to deliberately deny another person the essentials of life, then you can very clearly make an argument that it would be wrong to deliberately deny an unborn human person access to a womb. But let's pretend that right doesn't exist. That question, does the fetus have a right to occupy the womb, is still not the right question. The right question is this: even if a fetus doesn't have a right to occupy a womb, does that mean that we have the right to terminate and expel the fetus from the womb? Now that is a very different question. And that really gets to the heart of this ethical debate. And by the way, we would never ever say yes to that outside of the womb, so why would we say yes to it inside the womb? Let me give you an example, a very example close to home. Let's say a Syrian refugee turned up in this country, Australia, an 18-year-old Syrian refugee. And the Syrian refugee had destroyed her passport and her documentation. She has smuggled herself into Australia aboard a ship. She has no passport and documents. She cannot be sent back home. She has no legal right to be here in Australia. She will obviously use up healthcare resources. She will take someone's job and income. And about 6 months after she lands here, she's caught by the police on the streets on a totally unrelated matter, and they discover she has no legal right to be here in Australia. Does that mean that because she's got no right to be here and you can't send her anywhere else, that the state of Australia, or the country of Australia, has the right to terminate her life and then scatter her ashes in some pauper's grave? Of course they don't. Why? Because we go all the way back to that first question. She's a human person. That's why that is the most fundamental question in this debate. See, the big problem with the bodily rights argument is this. What it's trying to do is it's trying to promote a culture where we have rights without responsibilities. That's a problem because the very reason we need rights is because our existence as human persons is communal. We exist, we live, we grow and develop in community. And obviously there are going to be conflicts in a community of rights. One party or parties are going to butt up against another group. And so therefore, you don't just talk about my rights and my autonomy, you talk about my rights and my autonomy in relation to the community. All sorts of ethical debates, this is very important. I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who once famously said, your right to do whatever you want to with your body, with your fist, ends at the point at which my nose begins. Okay, so this idea that you just do what you want without regard to the community is not an authentic and good way to approach. You certainly can't maintain civil society that way. Secondly, what the bodily rights argument tries to do is it takes the most important human right of all and treats it as secondary to a lesser human right. The most important human right of all is the right to life. The reason it's called your fundamental human right is because without the right to life, if you're not alive, you cannot exercise any other human rights. Every other human right that you have depends on the right to life. That's why it's called the cardinal or the fundamental human right. And in the hierarchy of rights, it is the pivotal rights. It's at the very top. Now, your right to bodily autonomy is still an important right. No one should be able to take your body and use it against your will. However, it is secondary to the right to life. And what the bodily rights argument is trying to do is say that you should take a secondary right and make it more important than the most important human right of all. And third and finally, what the bodily rights argument is suggesting is that the strong should get to decide what human rights the vulnerable are given. See, this is quite frightening because even Judith Jarvis Thompson says that in her essay, she says she doesn't believe this. She's pro-choice. She doesn't believe that an unborn person is a person. But she says, even if a fetus is an unborn person, she says, I believe my bodily rights argument would still justify abortion. Now that's really frightening because not even the slave traders or the Nazis tried that. What they did was they were wrong in what they did in those former atrocities, but what they did was their reasoning was sound, their application was wrong, and just and gravely wrong. But what their reasoning was is this: if you're a human person, you get human rights. If you're not a human person, you don't get human rights. So in the issue of slavery, there were people, particularly when eugenics was at its popular height, who tried to claim that people of non-Aryan descent usually were not fully persons, so therefore they didn't get human rights. The Nazis had a word, Untermenschen, subhuman, right? And they said Jews were subhuman, they don't get human rights. But what Judith Jarvis Thompson is now saying is, even if you are a human and you're a person, I still think it would be okay to abort you. Now that's frightening, because now your personhood is no longer enough to guarantee you protection. And what that means is your entire framework of human rights is now meaningless. It has totally become might makes right. The strong gets to decide what happens to the vulnerable. And that's truly, truly frightening. You can't continue to operate in a society without that particular ideology really starting to make itself felt. And the other thing I'll say is that when you stop and look at all of these arguments that people use to try and justify abortion, almost all of them would also justify infanticide. Right? And so if you are, now sadly some people, they look at that situation and they go, oh okay, well I've adopted an ethical policy that's putting me on the bus to infanticide town, I'll just keep going there. Thankfully they're in the minority. Most people rightly look at that and they recoil with that and they start to think critically about what it is they are buying into. But I think it's an important point to raise with people whenever this issue arises. What I often do is I start people outside the womb and then walk them back in and I say, right, tell me at which point you think this is okay. Let's have that conversation. And you find it's a very effective way of actually getting to the heart, because so many people will throw up all sorts of red flags. What about poverty? What about this? What about that? And I always try and take them back to that fundamental question. What is it that's growing in that womb and when do you think it's okay? Because, to be pro-choice, but what choice are you actually pro-people choosing? Abortion. What is abortion? And I think it's fundamental that we talk people through that. I just want to finish up with, if I can, one common thing I get asked is about the issue of what about pregnancy after rape? Doesn't that justify abortion? And in response to that, I like to ask some questions. First of all, people who bring this issue up, I would say, do you think that human beings conceived in rape have less dignity than people who are conceived in love or in other ways? Do you think? And most people would say, well, no, of course not. Then why would we treat them differently in a womb? Are you less of a human being if you are conceived in rape? Should you get the same respect and human rights as the rest of us? And I don't yet to meet a person who says, well, no, you should be treated differently. So again, why would we treat them differently when they're in a womb? Does abortion bring a rapist to justice? Undo the crime of rape, bring healing to the victim of the terrible atrocity that is rape? No, it doesn't do any of those things. It simply creates another victim. And lastly, do rape-conceived people want to come into existence this way, or are they also victims? Now, this for me has been a pivotal question, because a lot of people, when they approach this issue, they think of the unborn as being a perpetrator and aggressor. I often say to people, why do you assume that the unborn child belongs to the father? Why is the unborn child not a part of the mother in this scenario, right? Now, that's a very important question. I heard Rebecca Kiesling on CNN a couple of years ago. Rebecca Kiesling is a pro-life activist from the States. She was conceived by rape herself. She's a special work that she does in this area. And she was on the Piers Morgan show, which is particularly hostile, after Senator Todd Aiken, I think, made his poorly thought out comments about legitimate rape, whatever that comment was he made. And she presented some research which was quite interesting. She said, look, in America, approximately 50% of all unplanned consensual sex pregnancies end up in a Planned Parenthood or an abortion clinic. However, only 15 to 25% of rape-conceived pregnancies end up in an abortion clinic. Now that's interesting because you often hear people using this argument as if it's the lived real-world experience of women that the first thing they want is to be taken to an abortion clinic. Well, according to that data, in actual fact, we're talking 75 to 85% of rape-conceived pregnancies are carried to full term. Right? And this is, again, when I say to people, well, why would you treat a rape-conceived person differently when they're in a womb? You're getting back to this question. I often say to people, let's imagine this scenario. Let's imagine that a woman conceives a child after rape. The child is born. She wants to have the baby. 6 months after the child is born, though, she completely changes her mind. She says, I wasn't ready for this. I was just under a psychological black cloud. I made a wrong decision. I don't want this child anymore. I don't want to adopt it out either. I don't want to have a living flesh and blood memorial of this horrific atrocity that was perpetrated against me. I want to smother this child in its crib to end my pain. Would that be okay? I've yet to meet a person who says yes. Everyone says, well, of course not. And then after I've said that, I say, well, why not? Because it's a person. So let's start walking back through into the womb and tell me at what point you think it ceases to be a person and why it would be okay because it was conceived in the womb to treat it that way. I want to finish this by giving you a great quote I often like to share with people from the movie North Country, which was directed by Kiwi director Nicky Carr, who also directed Whale Rider, those have seen that. And North Country stars Charlize Theron, and it tells the true story of a group of women who worked in an open cast mine in North Alaska and had to take a court case because of the treatment they were receiving. Charlize Theron, the main character, has a son who's about 12 or 13 years of age, and we discover halfway through the film that he's been conceived in rape. And this is what she says to him. And I think it's a profound enunciation of the pro-life position on this issue. I was a girl who was raped, and you were this thing that just kept reminding me of it. This one night I was lying in bed and you moved inside me like this tiny little butterfly, just fluttering around in there. And all of a sudden I realised I just knew. I knew you weren't his, you were mine. You were my baby, and we were going to be in it together. Just the two of us. You had nothing to do with that, ugliness, you hear me? Nothing. And to me that beautifully and succinctly sums up the pro-life approach to this issue. Why care for one when we can care for both? Right? Isn't that the humane response? Not rushing someone off to an abortion clinic and then putting them into a situation that some of my friends who specialise in post-abortion care will tell you is creating a perfect psychological storm for even greater psychological trauma, which is sexual violation, and then adding the possibility of post-abortion trauma on top of that. Why would we do that? And yes, this is hard, this is difficult, but guess what? That's the reality of humanity and caring and self-giving. It takes effort, and you are required to make sacrifice to do that. But isn't this the fundamental of what a humane society is supposed to look like? Thanks for listening. I think that's all I want to say in this session. Thank you.